Elias Thorne crested the ridge at sunset, but the valley below offered no welcome, only the whispering silence of ash. He stopped his horse, a high-country mustang that sensed the wrongness in the air. The smell was not the familiar scent of his father's chimney smoke, that sweet, sharp smell of curing hickory and baking bread. This was the smell of violation, the wet, acrid stink of pine beams quenched by melting snow. The sun was a sliver of bloody light on the western peaks, and it threw the valley into a profound blue shadow. Where the cabin should have been, there was nothing but a black, weeping circle in the snow, and at its center, standing like a broken tooth against the sky, the stone chimney. Elias did not urge the horse on. He sat in the saddle, the cold creeping through his buckskins, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes confirmed. He had been north, gone for 3 moons to the high rendezvous, sent by his father to trade, to learn, and to listen. He was returning a man, strong and ready. He was returning to silence. He finally nudged the horse forward, descending the familiar game trail, his heart a cold stone in his chest. The silence was absolute, no bark from his father's dog, no nicker from the mule. The valley, usually alive with the sound of the river and the wind, felt hollowed out, as if it were holding its breath. He dismounted at the edge of the ruin. The snow around the cabin was trampled, melted, and refrozen into a glazed black mess. He saw the tracks of shod horses, dozens of them, and the heavy cleated prints of company boots. This was not the work of Shoshone or Crow. Their passing was light, respectful. This was the work of greed, heavy and careless. He walked into the center of the char. The heat was long dead. He kicked at a pile of ash and something metallic clinked. He knelt, brushing the wet soot away. It was his mother's cast-iron skillet. Warped and cracked by the heat, he found the melted remains of his father's spectacles. He found the scorched brass buttons from the heavy wool coat Silas always wore. But he did not find his father. A new, sharper dread gripped him. He moved from the cabin, following the churned mud and snow toward the creek. He saw where they had dragged something heavy. The tracks led to the bank of the frozen Greybull River, to a small stand of aspens. There he found it, a pile of rocks, hasty and contemptuous. Not a proper burial cairn, but a mound of dismissal. The dog, a loyal hound named Blue, lay dead beside it. A single bullet hole through its neck. Elias put his hand on the cold stones. He did not need to dig. He knew who lay beneath them. Silas Thorne, a man who had lived in this valley for 30 years, a man who spoke the native tongues, who understood the balance, who had held the peace between the tribes and the trappers. He had been left in the ground like an animal, buried by men who feared his integrity more than his rifle. Elias looked around. He found a discarded tin of Pioneer's Pride chewing tobacco, a brand sold by the New Western Timber Company, the one that had tried to buy Silas out, the one Silas had refused. He saw where they had felled 3 ancient pines just to watch them fall. This wasn't just murder. It was a statement. It was the sound of the new world grinding the old one under its heel. Elias knelt by the frozen river, the last light of the sun fading from the peaks. He felt the cold, but it was inside him now, a cold, clear stillness. He had no tears. He had only the weight of the valley, the witness of the mountains, and the memory of his father's last words to him. Go north. Tell them the word of Silas Thorne is still good iron. The vow was not spoken, it was forged. Before we follow this trail any further, And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight, and what do you think he'll find beyond the ridge? The valley had been different only a season before. It was a place of deep peace, nestled in the high arms of the Wind River Range. Silas Thorne had come there not to conquer it, but to ask its permission to stay. He had built his cabin with timber hewn from trees that had already fallen, his chimney from river stones, his life from the rhythm of the seasons. He was a trapper by trade, but a philosopher by nature. He understood that the mountains demanded respect, not ownership. The Shoshone called him man who listens, and the Crow, he who shares his meat. His cabin was not a fortress. It was a trading post, a meeting place, a neutral ground where disputes were settled with tobacco and reason, not with lead and steel. He was the anchor that held the fragile peace of the high country together. He held it by the strength of his word, a word that had never been broken, not to a chief, not to a fellow trapper, not to the animals he hunted. This was the world Elias grew up in. He learned to track an elk for 2 days without tiring, to read the weather in the flight of a hawk, and to know that a man's honor was the only currency that mattered when the snows fell. But Silas saw the change coming. He saw it in the east, a shadow moving west, a hunger that could not be filled. It was a hunger for gold, for timber, for land, a hunger that saw the high peaks not as sacred, but as resources. This hunger had a name, Captain Reed. Reed, the foreman of the New Western Timber Company, had arrived in the late summer, backed by 50 hired men and a piece of paper signed by a politician back east, a paper that claimed this valley, this river, these trees. Reed offered Silas a fortune in gold coin. Silas refused. "This valley is not mine to sell, Captain," Silas had said, his voice calm. "It belongs to the wind, to the river, and to the people who have honored it for 1,000 winters." Reed, a man whose soul was as flat as the paper he carried, did not understand. He saw Silas as an obstacle, a stubborn old fool. "The future is coming, old man," Reed had sneered. "It needs this timber. It needs this water. You can either be paid for it, or you can be removed from it." Silas had stood on his porch, his old Hawken rifle resting in the crook of his arm, not as a threat, but as a fact. "You misunderstand," Silas replied. "This valley is protected, not by me, by an idea. You touch this place. You break a peace that cost more blood than you can measure. Leave." Reed left, his face dark with anger, his men muttering. Silas knew they would return. That was when he called Elias. He gave his son his best horse, a full pack, and his blessing. "It is time for you to go north to the gathering," Silas instructed. "Find Broken Hand. He and I, we share a debt from the winter of 33. Give him this token." He handed Elias a single polished grizzly claw. "Tell him the divide is shrinking. Tell him my word is still good iron. He will know what it means. Learn from those men, son. They are the last of the true mountains. Learn what it means to be bound by honor. I will be here when you return." Elias had ridden north, heavy with the mission, not knowing it was the last time he would see his father alive. He was sent north to forge the final link in the alliance his father had built. He was sent to learn what his father already knew, that when greed comes, a man cannot stand alone. He needs his brothers, bound not by blood, but by honor. The attack had come in the deep quiet of the first heavy snow, weeks after Elias had gone. Silas knew they would wait for the snow, They would wait for the cold to be their ally, to trap him, to ensure the high passes were closed and no help could come from his native allies. He was splitting wood, the axe ringing sharp in the frozen air, when he heard the jingle of harnesses. It was not the light sound of a trapper's mule. It was the heavy, rhythmic tread of a company line. 20 men, led by Captain Reed, emerged from the trees. They were not trappers. They were hired guns, their faces hard from whiskey and winter, their eyes empty of respect. They fanned out, surrounding the cabin, rifles leveled. Silas did not reach for his Hawken. He stood by the woodpile, axe in hand, and waited. He was one man, and he was old, but his name was a fortress. "Last chance, Thorn," Reed called, dismounting. He held up the same useless paper deed. "Sign the valley over to the company, and I'll let you walk out of here with your life." Silas looked at the paper, then at Reed's hard face. He let the axe head rest gently on the chopping block. "I told you, Captain," Silas said, his voice carrying in the stillness, "that paper means nothing here. The wind cannot read it. The mountain cannot see it. It is a lie you tell yourselves." Reed's face tightened. He hated this old man. He hated his calm, his certainty, his unshakable honor. It was a mirror that showed Reed his own hollow soul. "You think your friends will save you?" Reed spat. "The Crow are starving on the reservation. The Shoshone are hiding from the army, and your trapper friends are all dead or gone south. You are the last one, old man, and you are alone." Silas shook his head slowly. "I am never alone." He looked up at the peaks, grey and white against the sky. "I am with the valley, and the valley will remember." That was what broke Reed's patience. It was the calm, the refusal to be afraid. "I didn't want to do this," Reed lied, "but you leave me no choice." He signaled. 2 men grabbed Silas, pinning his arms. They were rough, but they were also afraid of him. They held him, forcing him to watch as Reed himself took a torch from his saddle. He lit it, the flame unnaturally bright against the snow. "This is the future, old man," Reed said, and he threw the torch onto the cabin's dry, seasoned porch. The resin-rich pine caught instantly. The fire roared, consuming 20 years of peace, consuming the memories of Elias's childhood, consuming the place that had been the heart of the high country. Silas did not struggle. He watched, his face carved from ice and sorrow, his eyes reflecting the flames. He was seeing the end of his era. When the roof began to collapse, Reed's men pushed Silas to the ground. "We will be back in the spring to clear this trash," Reed said, his voice raw with a victor's cruel pleasure. "If you are still here, we will put you in the ground with it." They mounted. They rode away, leaving Silas Thorn alone in the snow, his home a pyre, the promise of his own death hanging in the frozen air. We return to Elias, kneeling in the ruins, weeks later. He has pieced it together. The murder was not done that day. He could see that his father, defiant, had started to build a lean-to against the chimney. He had stayed. He had refused to leave. The tracks showed Reed's men had returned, perhaps a week ago, surprised to find him still there, still defying them. This time they had not bothered with words. They had finished the job. Elias stood, the cold clarity of his purpose settling into his bones. He was his father's son. He was the bearer of the grisly claw. He turned his horse's head north again. He did not just ride. He flew. He crossed the frozen high country, driven by a fire that the snow could not touch. He rode not for vengeance, which was a hot, blinding thing. He rode for the debt, which was cold, clear, and absolute. The journey north was a trial of fire and ice. Elias pushed himself and his horse to the limits of endurance. He rode into the teeth of a blizzard that lasted 3 days, navigating by the memory of the stars and the feel of the wind. The world dissolved into a howling whiteness, a place of ghosts and screaming wind. He did not sleep. He huddled behind rock drifts, sharing his meager jerky with his horse. The cold, a living thing that tried to claw its way into his heart. He thought of his father's body, left under those stones, and the thought was a fire that kept his blood moving. He was not just a son seeking justice. He was a messenger, carrying the last word of a king. He was crossing into the high basin, the place known as the Gathering of the North, a hidden valley where the mountains touched the sky. This was where the old ones, the true mountain men, had retreated. Men who had trapped with Jim Bridger, men who had known Jedediah Smith, men who refused to bow to the companies, the army, or the encroaching fences of the New World. When he finally rode into the valley, he was a spectre. His face was gaunt, his buckskin stiff with frost. His eyes burned with a feverish light. The camp was massive. Hundreds of skin lodges, lean-tos, and fires were scattered across the valley floor. This was the hidden heart of the frontier. French voyageurs, Scots-Irish wanderers, Métis traders, and delegations from the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne all gathered here, bound by a shared code of independence. Men stopped their work, skinning beaver, repairing rifles, arguing over cards, to watch him. They saw the look on his face. They saw the ghost of Silas Thorne riding with him. He did not stop until he reached the largest fire, where a man with a famously scarred left hand sat skinning a wolf. This was Broken Hand Fitzpatrick, the uncrowned leader of this gathering, the man his father had shared a debt with. Elias slid from his horse. His legs buckling, he stood before the old trapper. "Broken Hand," he said, his voice a raw croak. Broken Hand looked up, his eyes sharp and clear. "You are Silas's boy. You have returned too soon. You have the look of a hard trail and a dead fire." Elias reached into his pouch. His fingers, numb and cracked, fumbled with the string. He pulled out the polished grizzly claw. "My father, Silas Thorne, is dead." A profound silence fell over the fire. The wind in the pines was the only sound. "He was murdered by Captain Reed of the New Western Timber Company. They burned his cabin. They left him in the snow. They mean to take the 10 Sleep Valley by spring." He held out the claw. "My father sent me. He said to tell you his word is still good iron." Broken Hand looked at the claw. He did not take it. He looked at the faces of the 30 or 40 men who had gathered to listen. "Good iron," Broken Hand whispered. He looked back at Elias. "In the winter of 33, he said, his voice loud enough for all to hear, "the smallpox came. My partner was dying. My own hands were frozen. We were done. Silas Thorne rode 200 miles in a blizzard, and carrying medicine from the Shoshone, he saved my partner. He saved my hands." He turned to another man. "Jacques, tell the boy what Silas did in 38. The Frenchman stepped forward. "The snows were deep. The buffalo did not come. My family, they were starving. Silas. He brought us 2 elk. He fed us for a month. He asked for nothing." One by one, men stepped forward. A man whose life Silas had saved in a bar fight in St. Louis. a man whose trapping line Silas had protected from thieves, a man whose debt Silas had paid. Elias watched, stunned. He had known his father was respected. He did not know his father had built an empire of loyalty. Broken Hand finally stood. He was tall, and the firelight made him a giant. "Silas Thorne held the line," he roared. "He was the wall that kept the greed of the East from our valleys. They did not just kill a man. They broke the peace. They broke the code." He looked at the 300 men watching from their fires. "We are not soldiers," he yelled. "We are free men, but we are men of honor. A debt is owed." He turned to Elias, and this time he took the claw. "We ride at dawn, not for vengeance, for the debt." The return south was unlike any movement the mountains had ever seen. 300 men, the hardest men on the continent, rode as one. They were not a column of soldiers, loud and clumsy. They were a force of nature. They moved like a shadow, like the silent front of a winter storm. They were Scotsmen with their long rifles, Métis with their bright sashes and deadly knives, Shoshone scouts moving ahead, and old-time trappers whose faces were maps of the wilderness. They spoke little. They did not need to. They were bound by a single purpose, a purpose that ran deeper than blood. They were the mountain's immune system, rising to fight an infection. Elias rode at the front with Broken Hand and 3 Eagles, the Shoshone war chief who had been Silas's closest friend. Elias felt a power he had never known, not the power of a leader, but the power of a legacy. He was not leading these men. His father's life was leading them. They reached the Ten Sleep Valley in the false spring, when the snow was receding in wet patches, but the ground was still hard as iron. The valley felt defiled, the scar of the burned cabin a weeping wound. They made camp in the high trees, hidden from the valley floor. Scouts reported that Captain Reed was on his way, coming up from the south with a large party. They were not just gunmen this time. They were surveyors, axemen, and wagons loaded with supplies. They were coming to stay. They were coming to build their future on the ashes of Silas's past. Elias, Broken Hand, and 3 Eagles formed the plan. It was a hunter's plan, not a soldier's. They would not meet them with force. They would meet them with presence. They would be the valley, watching. At dawn, the 300 men vanished. They melted into the ridges, the timberlines, the high rocks overlooking the valley floor. They became the trees. They became the stones. Only Elias remained. He walked down to the ruins of his father's chimney. He sat on a fallen, charred log, his father's Hawken resting across his lap, and he waited. An hour later, they arrived. 50 men, led by Captain Reed. They rode in with arrogance, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls. They saw the lone figure sitting by the chimney. Reed smirked, reining in his horse. "Well," he boomed, "the cub. I heard you'd run north with your tail between your legs. Come back to beg for your father's scraps." Elias stood slowly. He was calm. The cold resolve that had filled him days ago was now an unshakable mountain. "I came to deliver a message, Captain," Elias said, his voice clear and carrying. "My father told you this valley was protected. You didn't listen." Reed laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Protected? By what? A ghost?" He unslung his rifle. "This is our land now, boy. Bought and paid for by the United States government. You are trespassing." He chambered around. "I'll give you one last chance to walk away." Elias did not look at Reed. He looked up at the north ridge, where he knew Broken Hand was watching. "It was never for sale," Elias said. "And you are not trespassing on my land." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "You are trespassing on theirs." "Theirs?" Reed looked around, confused, and then they rose. On the north ridge, Broken Hand stood, and beside him 100 mountain men rose from the rocks, their long rifles glinting in the sun. On the west ridge, 3 eagles and his Shoshone warriors appeared, bows drawn, silent and steady. On the east, the Métis trappers emerged from the pines, a line of deadly intent, 300 men, silent, watching, covering every escape. The laughter died in Reed's throat. His men froze, their hands hovering over their weapons. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by the sudden cold sweat of fear. They were surrounded. They were outnumbered. They were outclassed. The click of 300 rifle hammers being pulled back was the only sound in the valley. Broken Hand's voice echoed like thunder. "You have broken the peace, Captain. You have murdered a man of honor. This valley is not yours. It belongs to the mountains. You have 2 choices. Leave now and never return, or be buried here beneath the ashes of the man you murdered." Reed's face was pale. He saw the resolve. He saw the numbers. This was not a fight. It was an execution. Captain Reed did not speak for a long moment. He stared at the lines of silent men on the ridges, a living wall of frontier justice. He looked at Elias, no longer a boy, but the very embodiment of his father's will. The captain's greed had finally met a force it could not buy, bully or burn. His face, white with fear, slowly turned to a mask of humiliation. He lowered his rifle, the gesture sharp, defeated. "Mount up!" he gritted to his men. There was no argument. The surveyors and gunmen scrambled for their horses, their eyes wide, casting fearful glances at the hundreds of rifles still aimed at their hearts. They turned their wagons, the heavy wheels churning in the mud. They had ridden in with the sound of a new era. They left in the silence of a funeral. They rode out of the valley, and the 300 men watched them go, remaining perfectly still until the last sound of their retreat was swallowed by the wind. They would not be back. The new way had met the old, and the old had held. As the last man vanished, the men on the ridges walked down, converging on the ruins. There was no cheering. There was no celebration. This was not a victory. It was a balancing of the scales. It was the payment of a debt. They stayed for 3 days. They were not warriors. They were builders. They helped Elias. First, they retrieved his father's body from the hasty grave. They carried him up the ridge to a place overlooking the 10 Sleep, facing the rising sun. They built a proper cairn, a monument of stone that would stand for 1,000 years, a marker of a man who had kept his word. That night, they gathered around a great central fire. Elias sat with Broken Hand and 3 eagles, sharing tobacco. The weight of the last weeks settled on Elias. "He is gone," Elias said, his voice quiet. "We stopped Reed, but we did not stop the world he comes from. They will just come back, won't they? With soldiers, with more paper." 3 eagles, his face a map of wisdom, looked at the fire. "You are wrong, son of Silas," the old chief said. "You cannot stop the river from flowing. The ice melts, the water comes. That is the new season. Your father knew this. He did not try to stop the river. He tried to guide it. He built this cabin not as a dam, but as a meeting place." Broken Hand nodded, tapping his pipe on a stone. "The captain was one man. He lived by paper. Your father lived by his word. The paper burned. The word remains." He gestured with his pipe to the camp, to the 300 men resting, sharing stories, trading goods. "Look around you, boy. We are his word. We are his legacy. In that moment, Elias understood. His father hadn't died in vain. He hadn't lost. His father's true inheritance wasn't the cabin or even the valley. It was this. It was the alliance. It was the fortress of loyalty he had built, one act of honor at a time. Elias had come seeking justice for a murder. Instead, he had found the meaning of his father's entire life. Survival without respect was not victory. This was. When dawn broke on the fourth day, the valley was clean. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the scent of spring. The allies prepared to depart. They left as they had come, in small groups, melting back into the wilderness. They were heading north, west, and south, back to their traplines and their hidden valleys. Each man stopped to clasp Elias's hand, a quiet gesture of respect. Broken Hand was the last to leave. He put his scarred hand on Elias's shoulder. "Your father's fire is out," the old man said. "It is time for you to build your own. This valley is your watch now, Elias Thorne. Keep the word." He mounted his horse and, without looking back, rode north. Elias was alone again, standing by the ruins of his past. But he was not the same man who had found the ashes. He was no longer just the sun. He was the anchor. He stood for a long time, watching the sun climb the peaks. He looked at the fresh cairn on the hill. He looked at the river, flowing clear and strong. He then bent down and picked up a single smoke-stained stone from his father's chimney. He walked to the center of the clearing, to the exact spot where the cabin door had been. He set the stone down. It was the first stone of a new foundation. He would rebuild, not the same cabin, but a new one, a trading post, a meeting place. He would continue his father's work. The mountains test a man. They test his strength, his will, his endurance against the cold and the hunger. But the truest test, the test of the high peaks, is the weight of his word. Silas Thorne was a trapper, but his true trade was honor. He had built a fortress not of logs, but of loyalty. Greed can burn logs. It can spill blood. It can tear down the work of a man's hands. But it cannot break a promise that was kept. It cannot erase a debt that was paid. Captain Reed and his company vanished into the footnotes of lost ventures, their paper deeds rotting in a forgotten office back east. But the name of Silas Thorne and his son Elias became a story. It was a story told by the Shoshone, by the Crow, and by the mountain men who gathered in the high basins. They told of the winter when 300 men rode south, not for gold, not for land, and not for vengeance, but for the word of one good man. In the quiet places of the wilderness, a man's life is not measured by what he takes, but by what he builds. And the strongest things, courage without hate, victory without pride, and the bond between souls who share the same sky, these are the things that can never be burned to the ground. They are the legacy that rides the wind. If you enjoyed this story, stay a while longer by the fire. There are more tales from the high country where honor rides the wind.